Hello, my name is Ahmed. I never imagined I'd be here one day, sharing this intimate part of my life. But there came a time when keeping it all bottled up was just tearing me apart. I needed to speak out. I needed to share what God had done for me, even if it meant facing my greatest fear. For many years, I was an imam in a community in Saudi Arabia. I was a figure of authority, someone people came to for advice, prayers, and spiritual comfort. I knew the Quran by heart, led the 5 daily prayers, and preached every Friday with conviction. To everyone around me, I was a man of unshakable faith, but no one knew what was going on inside me. No one saw the silent war I waged deep within my soul. The truth is, for a long time, my faith was both a shield and a prison. I did everything right on the outside, but inside, I was drying up. Every time I opened my mouth to recite, my soul screamed silently. The words were beautiful, yes, but they echoed in a void within me, and it began to consume me. I asked myself, is this all there is? Is my faith real? Or is it just fear? Fear of thinking different, fear of losing everything. This internal struggle dragged on until one night, something happened. It was an ordinary night, or at least it should have been. The mosque was full, the air heavy with the smell of incense and sweat. I was leading the Isha prayer, as I had so often done. But that day, my voice seemed not to be my own. It was coming from my mouth, yes, but I felt nothing. It was as if I were watching someone else perform in my place. Everything seemed distant, automatic. I looked at the men around me, all kneeling with such dedication, and felt completely alone. It was then that I realized I was just playing a role. I was a spiritual leader who had lost his way, and this truth hit me like a punch to the chest. During prostration, with my face pressed against the mat, I tried to reconnect, calling out for some spark, anything that would remind me that I was still alive inside, but all I found was silence. Then something strange happened. A sharp dizziness hit me, as if the ground had shifted. The voices of the prayers around me began to sound distant, distorted, as if underwater. My body felt heavy, my arms unresponsive. It was as if something was pulling me away, and then it went dark. The last thing I saw was the carpet beneath my eyes unraveling, as if it were melting. And then, nothing. No pain, just the sensation of falling to a place where nothing made sense anymore. It was there, in that moment of darkness, that everything began to change. But I'll tell you about that part of the story. When my consciousness returned, it wasn't like waking from a simple faint. There was no sound, no sight, nothing. It was as if I were outside of time and space, an absolute void. There was no ground, no sky. I couldn't feel my body. I didn't know if my eyes were open or closed because there was nothing to see. I was just perception, a point of consciousness suspended in a crushing silence. At first, panic gripped me, a fear so pure, so primal, that no words can describe it. I tried to scream, but I had no voice. I tried to run, but I had no legs. I was no longer a man. I was just a soul, swallowed by a formless, soundless, endless abyss. I don't know how much time passed there. Maybe seconds, maybe 1,000 years. Time simply didn't exist in that. But then, something changed. In that suffocating silence, something, or someone, began to approach. It wasn't a physical presence, but a consciousness, and the closer it came, the more I felt it. It was as if that emptiness began to warm. The terror I felt gave way to a kind of awe. Something greater than myself was there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, as if it were inside me. That's when I heard, not with my ears, but with my heart, my name, Ahmed. But it wasn't like hearing anyone else calling me. It was different. This voice penetrated to the very core of me. It wasn't the call of an earthly father, nor the respect of a follower, nor the affection of a friend. It was the voice of someone who knew me completely, who saw beyond masks, roles, and religion, who saw every part of me, even the ones I hid from myself. At that moment, a wave of warmth began to fill that void. But it wasn't physical, it was life, it was love. A love that doesn't judge, doesn't demand, doesn't weigh down, a love that embraces. And it was in that moment the presence revealed itself. I am Jesus. Those 3 words echoed in my soul like thunder, in a place where there had never been a sound before. There was no argument, there was no debate. It was a direct, clear, powerful revelation, and somehow deeply familiar. It was as if I had always known, but had spent my entire life trying to. And then he started showing me. It wasn't like watching a movie. It was deeper. It was as if the truth was being poured right into me, as if my spiritual eyes and ears were finally being opened. The first thing he showed me was fear. I saw, with painful clarity, how fear had shaped every step of my life. Fear of hell, fear of God, fear of failure, of questioning, of stepping out of line, fear of being seen as unfaithful. And I also saw how this fear didn't come from God. He showed me leaders, systems, entire religions built on this fear, and how I, without realizing it, had become part of it. Every sermon in which I spoke more about God's wrath than his love, every time I asked for obedience without allowing questioning, every time I wielded religion like a sword, instead of offering hope, I was reinforcing the chains that bound my people. It crushed me. Seeing myself that way, not as a victim, but as an instrument of something I condemned, was like being struck directly in the soul. But Jesus didn't show me this to destroy me. He showed me this to free me. Then, he broadened my vision. What came next was no longer just about me. It was as if my spiritual eyes were pulled far away from that place of darkness, and suddenly, I was seeing the world from a different perspective. Jesus showed me the real war, not between religions, cultures, or peoples, as I had always been taught, but an invisible battle waged in the heart of every human being. A war between fear and love, between slavery and freedom, between lies and truth. And for the first time, I understood. The war wasn't Islam versus Christians. It wasn't East versus West. It was something much more subtle, much deeper. It was the world's system trying to keep people captive from within, even using religion as a tool. And there, in this place where no mask could hide who I was, he showed me how my own faith, the faith to which I had dedicated my entire life, had been distorted. I saw how words that were supposed to bring healing were transformed into weapons of division, how religion was used to keep people afraid of God, afraid of each other, afraid of those who were different, and I saw my role in this. The pain I felt upon seeing this was indescribable, not because God condemned me, but because I myself saw how much I had helped, without realizing it, to perpetuate these chains. But Jesus, he didn't expose me to shame me. He showed me all this with eyes of compassion, and then, without demanding anything of me, without a list of tasks or ritual, he offered me something: peace. But it wasn't the peace I knew. It wasn't the silence of the mosque after prayer, nor the feeling of having fulfilled my duty. It was a living peace, a presence that filled everything within me, a peace that demanded no effort, that demanded no performance. It just was, and I was simply enveloped by it, like an embrace I'd been waiting for since birth. And there, in that sacred moment, the chains that had bound me my entire life began to break. The obligation, the fear, the need to be accepted by God through perfection. All of it dissolved in that love. For the first time, I truly breathed, not with my body, but with my soul. And within that breath, a new purpose was so powerful it made me want to cry and run away at the same time. It was then that everything changed again. One instant, I was in that divine embrace. The next, I was thrown back into my body, and it was brutal. The first thing I felt was the roughness of the mosque carpet against my face. I tasted blood in my mouth. I must have bitten my tongue when I fell. The sound came back like thunder, a whirlwind of hurried voices, footsteps, calls for water. "Imam, are you listening? Someone call for help." The smell of sweat, incense, and masculine perfume surrounded me. I slowly opened my eyes, and the artificial light hit me like sunlight directly in my eyes. I blinked several times, confused. I saw familiar faces leaning over me, faces of men I'd known all my life, men who had prayed with, learned from me, and yet, something in them had changed. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. I saw them with different eyes now. I saw the genuine concern, yes, but I also saw the fear I knew so well. Fear of thinking for oneself, fear of stepping out of line, fear of God as a merciless judge. It was as if invisible chains were encircling, and what shocked me most was realizing that, until just a few minutes before, I, too, had been chained in the same way. Two brothers helped me sit up. Their hands were firm, but they seemed to belong to another world. I was still between two worlds, feeling the touch of earth, but with my heart trapped in that place of eternal peace. "Are you okay, Ahmed? You fainted," one of them said, his eyes wide, not knowing what to think. I wanted to respond, but no words came out. How could I explain something that couldn't be explained in human language? How could I tell someone that I found Jesus in the midst of darkness? How could I say that, after everything I'd experienced, my soul no longer belonged to that system? I could only stare, and in my silence, I knew my life would never be the same. I looked at that familiar face, the impeccable turban, the carefully combed beard, the eyes waiting for a ready answer. And I knew exactly what they expected me to say. It was just the pressure. "I'm fasting." It was the heat. "Allah is testing me." But any of those phrases would have been a betrayal of the truth that still burned brightly. They felt like empty words, dry dust in my mouth. I couldn't pretend. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse, guttural sound, as if my voice had forgotten how to exist in that world. Then, instinctively, I put my hand to my chest, where that peace still burned. Not like a gentle relief, but like an ember that burned without hurting. It was intense, alive, and at the same time, everything around me seemed erased. disconnected. I was there, but I wasn't any. It was at that moment that I realized something strange. I felt like a visitor in my own life, a stranger in my body. The carpet, the mosque, the faces, the voices, everything seemed familiar and at the same time, profoundly strange. The contrast between the outside world and what now existed within me was brutal, irreconcilable. Someone crouched down beside me and told me I needed to rest, trying to help me up. But I pulled away, without hostility. It was instinctive, as if touching someone now could erase what had just happened. This was sacred, this was fragile. And somehow, I knew the old world would try to rip from me what I had just received. I looked up and saw the mosque hall. The prayer had stopped. Everyone was standing, looking at me. The silence that fell was no longer the reverent silence of devotion. It was a silence of tension, of fear, of judgment. And in the midst of that silence, I sensed something shifting. The concern in their eyes began to morph into something more subtle, colder, suspicion, doubt, distrust. Because imams don't faint. Men of faith don't collapse in front of the community. Something was off script, and people, even if they didn't say anything, were already trying to find theological, doctrinal, or even spiritual explanations for what they couldn't understand. Was it a spiritual attack? Is he straying? Did he see something? I could feel these questions floating in the air, and there, surrounded by those who had walked with me my entire life, I had never felt so alone. The weight of what I had seen, of what I now knew, was overwhelming. It wasn't just a new understanding, it was a calling, a responsibility. It was like carrying a flame that could illuminate or burn. Jesus had lit something in me, a fire I could no longer quench. But what was I going to do with it? How was I going to tell these people that everything they believed, everything I myself had taught for years, was rooted in something twisted? How could I look them in the eye and tell them it wasn't God who held them captive, but the way they presented him? That's when I realized the depth of the challenge. I had the key. I could see the cell, but they didn't even know they were trapped. And if I used that key, if I dared open that door, their whole world could crumble. I would be seen as a heretic, as a traitor, as someone who had gone mad. The fear that gripped me there wasn't like the fear of punishment, of retribution, of hell. It was a different kind of. It was the weight of the mission, the fear of failing to uphold the truth, the fear of remaining silent when I should speak. Jesus' words came back to me clearly. This is a spiritual. And there, with my knees still weak and my heart pounding, I realized I was on the front lines. And the first battle was about to begin, right there, on that carpet stained with sweat and anticipation. Under the restless eyes of the men who had once called me leader. They lifted me up. I walked with help to the exit. Each step echoed as if I were crossing two worlds. The mosque seemed heavier, darker. The night air, which had always brought me, now felt thick, difficult to breathe. The walk home, which used to be short and peaceful, dragged on like a desert crossing. Because now I knew I was not the same anymore, and it could never be again. Every step along the old cobblestone streets felt strange now. I'd known them since I was a child. Every corner, every carved gate, every wooden lattice window. But that night, everything felt artificial, as if I were walking through a set for a play, where I was no longer part of the cast. I was no longer the same man, and nothing was familiar anymore. The two brothers walking beside me maintained a silence that carried more weight than words. They were no longer just accompanying, they were watching me. I could feel their gaze, not of concern, but of calculation, as if trying to understand what I'd become. The respected imam they once followed had vanished before their eyes, and what remained now was doubt. I raised my eyes to the sky, seeking comfort in the stars that had so often comforted, but even they seemed more distant, colder, as if even the universe had stepped back, respecting the abyss that had opened within me. The peace that had filled my soul moments before now felt like a memory, still alive, but being swallowed by the pressure of reality around me. We reached my door, and before we could even knock, it opened. Ila, she already knew. The news had traveled faster than our steps. Her eyes were wide, her skin pale, fear dripping from her expression. Ahmed, they said you fell. What happened? She pulled me inside with trembling hands. Right behind her, my mother, covered in her usual veil, murmured verses from the Quran in a low, almost desperate whisper. They tried to console me, to make me sit down, offering me water, food, explanations. All at the same time. Was it your heart? Have you been eating well? Did someone hurt you? I looked at their faces, two of the people I've loved most in my life, and saw in them the same pattern I'd seen at the mosque. Fear. But not a fear of illness or tragedy. It was a deeper fear. The fear of the inexplicable. The fear of everything falling apart. Of something that can't be fixed with prayer or a doctor. I wanted to hug them. I wanted to tell them everything would be okay. But I knew it would. because now I carried within me a truth that couldn't be put into words. And this truth wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous, because it challenged not just beliefs, but the entire emotional, cultural, and spiritual system on which our lives had been built. The kind of truth that has the power to make the ground disappear from under our feet. The only thing I could say was, I am fine. But even my own voice sounded weak, as if it knew it was lying. Ayla narrowed her eyes. She knew me. She knew something was deeply wrong. No, Ahmed, you're not well. You never faint. What happened in that mosque? The question hung there, hovering between us, like a broken bridge between two worlds. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say, I met Jesus. He spoke to me. He showed me the truth. But I couldn't. I knew what would happen. They would think I was crazy, or possessed, or worse, that I had betrayed our faith, our history, our people. So I did the only thing I could still do with integrity. I remained silent. I didn't lie. I didn't make excuses. I just looked away. And in that gesture, in that heavy, meaningful silence, something broke. I saw it in my wife's eyes. The disappointment, the insecurity, the fear. She was no longer looking at the man she had married. She was looking at a stranger. Without realizing it, at that moment, I laid the first brick of a wall between us. And I knew that from now on, it would only grow. That night, I asked to be left alone. I locked myself in the small room I used as an office. I refused food. I turned off the lights, and I sat silently in the dark. Because before talking to the world, I needed to learn to live with this new light that had been born within me. The silence of that house, where I had so often found solace, now sounded like a muffled scream. Every creak of the wooden floor, every vague noise from the street, seemed to echo inside me like hammer blows. I sat in the darkness, trying with all my might to recapture the peace that had enveloped me in the void, the living, overwhelming presence of Jesus. But now it seemed distant, like a perfume lingering in the air after someone has left. In place of peace came guilt, heavy, cruel. First, for having frightened my family, Ila, my mother. I could see their faces, the fear, the confusion. Then, the deepest guilt. All the years I had spent preaching something I now saw clearly was not the truth. I hadn't just believed in the prison. I had helped build the bars. This revelation didn't come as a gentle, it was a crushing weight, a burden that threatened to break me from within. Christ's presence had stripped me of everything I thought I was, but it hadn't yet shown me what I was supposed to be now. I was a divided man, one foot still planted in the old faith, the other hesitant before something new, mysterious, and true. And these two halves fought within me as if the very air had become a battleground. The night dragged on, endless. I paced the office, touching the books that had once been sacred to me. Thick volumes of Islamic jurisprudence, tafsirs, collections of hadith, the very ones that had shaped my mind and my reputation. But now, the smell of leather, the feel of the thin pages, all of it sickened. They reminded me of the prison I had defended so passionately. I closed my eyes and, for a moment, returned to that vision. I saw again the emptiness, the warmth, the invisible gaze of Jesus upon me. I felt again that love that penetrated layers I hadn't even known existed. But soon after, another voice infiltrated, the old familiar voice of doctrine, trying to rewrite the experience. That was a mistake, a trick from Shayan, a test. You were vulnerable, don't be fooled. That voice spoke as I myself would have spoken, just a few days earlier. It sounded logical. It was the most comfortable explanation. The one that fit perfectly into the drawers of my theology. But there was a problem. It was not true. The peace I felt, the light, the presence, it was more real than any prayer I had ever prayed, more real than any sermon I had ever preached. It couldn't be the work of evil, but even so, my heart was split in two. One desperately trying to hold on to what I knew, the other, bleeding, trying to follow the truth. Dawn was breaking on the horizon, and I was exhausted, destroyed. I needed something, anything, to help me breathe, an anchor. And then a thought appeared, frightening, but clear as lightning. I need to read your words. The words of Jesus. For an imam like me, this thought was almost blasphemous. I had never read the Bible. I never dared. Isa, as the Quran called him, was an honored prophet, yes. But this Jesus I met was different, much more than I had ever imagined. And now I needed to meet him. Again, I turned on the computer, my heart pounding. Every click sounded like an alarm. I felt like at any moment my house would be invaded. Sirens, doors being broken down, the religious police, my family's screams, anything seemed possible. I opened the browser. My hands were shaking so much that I had to type twice. I used everything I knew about anonymous browsing, every precaution, every trick, hiding like a criminal in my own home. Because there, in that culture, that was exactly what I would become. I searched for words of Jesus. Nothing more. Just that. I didn't know where to begin. I had no idea what to look for. I just needed one word, One phrase. Something that said, "You're not crazy. I'm here." After scrolling through links, forums, and blocked sites, I found a simple place. No images, no noise, just text, an online Bible, a clean page, like a half-open door. I took a deep breath. My eyes burned. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, as if asking for permission. His name pulsed within me. I didn't know, but at that moment, I was about to hear Jesus speak again, and this time, in writing. Without knowing exactly what I was doing, I clicked on a link that said, Gospel of John. It was instinctive, almost as if my soul had guided me. My eyes began to scan the text, and I felt like someone committing a crime. But suddenly, a sentence stopped me. There was no lightning, no thunder. It was just this. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I stood still. I repeated those words in my mind, then in a low voice, and without realizing it, the tears began to fall, silently. It was as if someone had described exactly what I was experiencing. I was there, in the midst of such profound darkness, made of confusion, fear, tradition, and silence, and suddenly, a light had appeared. And even though I didn't understand it, even though everything inside me screamed that it was dangerous, the light was winning. She was not destroyed. She was not erased. Charmaine. That sentence didn't give me a theological answer, but it did give me something even more important. Testimony to my soul. The same presence that found me in the void now found me in those words. It was the same voice, the same love. I closed the browser as if I'd touched something sacred. My whole body trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was somewhere between terror and wonder. All of it. It was real. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't an outside influence. It was real. And this certainty, instead of relieving me, crushed me. Because now I knew there was no turning back. I could no longer wear the skin of the old Ahmed. The title of Imam, the life I had built, the rituals, all of it was now a wall between me and the truth that had been revealed to me. I had crossed an invisible line, and on the other side, there was only one path, an unknown, lonely, and dangerous path. That little light inside me, ignited by Joan's words, was real, but around it, the world remained dark. And to follow that light, I would have to walk against everything I knew, against fear, against tradition, against my own home. The sun began to rise, spilling its pale light through the cracks in the window. But that dawn gave me no peace. On the contrary, it seemed to announce the beginning of a war. The call to dawn prayer rang out across the city. My body reacted out of habit. I got up, washed my hands, feet, and face, as I had done since I was a boy. The water felt icy, devoid of any. I donned my prayer robe, joined my family on the rug. The words wouldn't. My mouth fell silent. So did I bowed. I touched my forehead, but it wasn't it was just an empty gesture, a show to avoid arousing suspicion. So we sat down to breakfast. The table was set, as always. Ela served me bread, without looking me in the eye. My mother, sitting silently, moved her lips in hurried prayers, looking at me as if trying to ward off some invisible evil. I took a piece of bread. I sipped my tea. It all felt like part of a movie I was no longer a part of. I was a stranger in my own home. They didn't know what had happened to me, but they knew something had changed. And this invisible absence of the old Ahmed was more present than any words. The community's reaction was not long in coming. That same morning, 2 of the mosque's most respected men came to my door. They were men I'd known for years, leaders, spiritual authorities, fathers of families. But their faces were different now. They were a mix of concern and distrust. They sat in the room with the seriousness of those who came to seek answers, not to offer comfort. They refused the tea that Ila had kindly brought. The oldest of them, Ibrahim, looked me in the eye and said directly, "Ahmed, we're worried about you. What happened last night shook the entire community. Some brothers in the community began to suggest that I was under some kind of evil influence. Perhaps it's a very great spiritual burden," one of them said softly. Another suggested that I needed to undergo a ruqya, a kind of spiritual purification. To them, these were the only possible explanations. Either I was sick in body, or the enemy had found a breach in my soul. Nothing else made sense within the system. They were trying to fix me, fit me back into the mold, replace the lid on the box that had been violently opened. But as they spoke with their calm words and their unshakable trust in the old structure, something inside me screamed. Those voices which had once given me security now felt like bars, and the walls of the cell where I had lived for so many years began to close in again. But this time, I could see them. It was at that moment that a young man appeared at my... He was a well-known neighborhood boy, someone with a reputation for drinking too, getting into fights, and being one of the community's deviants. Any other time, I would have reprimanded him harshly, but now I saw things differently. The elders looked at him with immediate disdain, but I saw something else. I saw in that boy's eyes the same weariness that consumed me, the same shame, The same weight of never being good enough, of living trying to reach a standard that only crushed him. He wasn't some distant sinner. He was my cell brother. Without thinking, I interrupted the elder's conversation, got up, and walked over to him. I took a piece of bread from the table and some coins that were stored near the entrance and placed them in his hands. I looked him in the eye and said, "Go in peace, brother. May you feel a little lightness today." He was paralyzed. I was too, inside, because I realized I was doing, for the first time, something that truly resembled what Jesus would do. And all around me, I felt judgment growing. The coldness in the elder's eyes said it all. I had crossed the line. They didn't see compassion. They saw imbalance, trip, heresy. But in that instant, I knew for sure. I may have failed their test, but I had passed God's. After the young man left, they resumed their authoritative tone, talking about my responsibilities, the Friday sermon, the need to keep up appearances and preserve community order. But their words no longer reached me. I was there, but my spirit had already departed. And then a brutal clarity descended upon me. I couldn't go on any longer. To stand on that pulpit, to repeat the same words I had taught for so long, words I now knew were tainted by fear and control, would be like betraying the light that had reached me. The thought made me sick. I could no longer be the guardian of a prison I had just left. It was no longer a doubt. It was a decision. Cold, clear, irreversible. I wouldn't do the sermon and I would no longer lead prayer. I wouldn't use that title, and when the elders left, a heavy calm washed over. It was the kind of peace that comes after a final judgment. Not relief, but certainty. A decision born not of emotion, but of revelation. It wasn't anger. It wasn't despair. It was like looking at a diagnosis and knowing, this is it. There's no going back. I looked around my house. I saw my grandmother's prayer rug, the theology books my father had given me, the wedding photo of me and Ela, all symbols of a life that, until yesterday, had defined who I was. And now they were just reminders of an identity I could no longer carry. Leaving my post wasn't like changing professions. It was like ceasing to be myself. It was like ripping off my own skin. It meant erasing my name, tarnishing my family's honor, becoming an outcast, an invisible ghost. It was social and spiritual suicide. That abyss of loneliness I'd been feeling for the past few days was no longer a distant thing. It was a destiny I was choosing to face with open eyes. The peace I had found in the presence of Jesus came at a price, and that price was everything I knew. And that night, I decided to act. I waited for the house to fall silent, for the calm rhythm of Isla's breathing beside me to assure me that she would fall asleep. I got out of bed with the caution of a burglar, feeling every floorboard creak like a warning cry. In the darkness, I gathered the bare minimum, a small bag containing all our money, a simple change of clothes, and my documents. I left behind my imam's robes, my sacred books, and my old identity card. Releasing those objects was like getting rid of dead weight. Before leaving, I paused at the threshold of our room. Moonlight bathed Ila's serene face. An intense wave of guilt and pain nearly overwhelmed me. I loved her more than any words could say, and what I was doing was the most profound cruelty a husband can commit, abandoning her amid unanswered questions and shame. A silent tear ran down my face, and in a whisper I begged for forgiveness. A forgiveness she would never hear. I turned away before the weight of the pain me faltered. The dark, empty street greeted me with its biting cold. It was the loneliest moment of my life, but it was also a confirmation. I was outside, not just of the house, but of the life I had known. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but to me it was the sound of the end of the world. The streets I'd walked so familiarly now seemed like a hostile maze. With no plan, no destination, I had only one burning certainty: to keep moving forward. I walked toward the bus station on the outskirts of the city, a place where I could disappear among other travelers, be just another face in the crowd. Each step took me further away from my identity, from the name I carried, from the story that shaped me. I was no longer Imam Ahmed, I was a fugitive. Adrenaline drove me, but at every turn the image of Ila sleeping invaded my mind, bringing a sharp pain. I raced after the truth, but to do so, I had to be a liar, a deserter of the very person I had promised to protect. When I arrived at the bus station, before dawn, the place was just beginning to swell with workers and passengers. For the first time in years, no one looked at me with respect or expectation. I was just another tired man carrying a small bag, lost among so many others. This anonymity, as frightening as it was liberating, enveloped me. With shaky steps, I bought a ticket for the first bus leaving for a distant city, a place where no one would ever hear my name. The woman at the ticket booth barely glanced at me, and that simple exchange, a ticket and cash, was the first act of my new. I got on the bus, sat next to the window. The engine roared, the lights went out, and the world I knew was left behind. The bus began to leave my city behind, and I didn't look back once. I was completely alone, penniless, nameless, with no clear future. But for the first time since that night at the mosque, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. I was no longer trapped inside the cage I'd built myself. The spiritual war had cost me everything, and now I was an exiled soldier, lost in hostile territory. When the bus dropped me off at a huge, noisy bus station that felt like a world apart from my city, the impact was overwhelming. The sound was a whirlwind: horns honking, vendors shouting, engines roaring, thousands of voices mingling. I had never felt so small, so invisible. All my life I had a name, a position, a place. Now, I was just dust. For the first few days, I wandered aimlessly, sleeping wherever I could, in cheap shelters, on the street when there was no other option. Hunger was a constant companion, and the fear of what was to come was a thick fog that wouldn't leave me. That spiritual war that, in my mind, seemed like a grand and heroic struggle, in reality was a brutal battle for survival, for a piece of bread, for a corner where I could close my eyes and rest for it. Anonymous freedom became silent desperation. I had escaped prison, yes, but now I was lost in an indifferent jungle, and loneliness was a predator that stalked me relentlessly. After a few weeks, I landed a menial job, carrying boxes at a supermarket. It was low pay, paid in cash, no questions asked, enough to rent a cramped room and buy food every day. The physical exhaustion helped silence the voices in my head, but it was only a respite. As soon as some stability returned, the spiritual urgency that drove me to escape came back with full force. I hadn't risked everything just to survive. The memory of that encounter with Jesus was the only real thing I had left, and I felt a desperate need to understand it better. I began to observe the city with watchful eyes, almost like a spy. I looked for signs, places that might provide answers. I saw large mosques and felt a shiver of fear and rejection, but I also noticed crosses atop some building. Every time I saw one, my heart raced, a mixture of fear and a strange attraction. I was in forbidden territory, and every look could be a risk. One day, following an impulse I couldn't control, I approached one of those buildings. It wasn't an imposing cathedral, but a small, simple church tucked between two shops. The door was open. I stood across the street for almost an hour, just watching. My entire body was on alert. A lifetime of doctrine told me that this place was a nest of heresy, dangerous ground. But every person who entered seemed calm, normal. I fought the panic and the voice of my old self screaming at me to run. But in the end, my heart pounding, I crossed the street and stopped at the entrance. The air inside smelled of old wood and dust, not incense. No one looked at me with suspicion or judgment. Hesitantly, I took a step inside. The silence was different from what I knew at the mosque. It wasn't an order, but an invitation. I sat on the last bench feeling like an intruder, expecting to be kicked out at any moment, but nothing happened. I simply stood there breathing slowly, hidden in the shadows of that place. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could relax, let my guard down. Little by little, I began to return, always sitting in the back, just listening. I didn't understand much of the rituals, but I paid attention to the stories, the songs, the words of love and forgiveness that filled that space. One day, after a meeting, a small group gathered to chat and drink coffee. A man began to share his story. He told how he felt trapped in a life filled with religious rules that only left him empty, and how, at some point, he cried out for something true, something that would change everything. As he spoke, a shiver ran through me. He used different words, came from a different context, but the feeling was the same prison, the same struggle for freedom, the same inexplicable peace. For the first time, I looked at someone and saw my own soul reflected. In that instant, the crushing loneliness I'd carried began to dissipate. I wasn't crazy, nor was I alone. It was the beginning of my true community, a refuge for exiles like me, united not by doctrine but by the scar a divine encounter had left within us. In the weeks that followed, that small group became my family. For the first time, I told my story without fear. I spoke of the mosque, the emptiness, the collapse, the darkness, and the voice that called my name. As the words tumbled out, I expected shock, distrust, maybe even pity. But what I found were nods, knowing looks. No one interrupted me. No one tried to correct me or fit my experience into a formula. They just listened to me. When I finished, there was no judgment, just hugs. I also received the gift of their testimonies, each bringing a version of the same story. Liberation from a faith based on fear to one based on love. The communion I found there was not built on rituals or traditions, but on the recognition of our scars and the shared joy of our healing. The peace I felt in that space was alive, active, something the silence and rigid obedience of the mosque could never offer. Slowly, the broken magnet inside me began to feel whole again. But even in that refuge, the shadows of my past were long and persistent. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, with Illa's face vivid in my mind, Guilt consumed me. What had happened to her? How was she dealing with the shame I'd caused her? I imagined the elders questioning her, the disappointed looks on her family's faces, the isolation she must be suffering. These thoughts were like poison, whispering doubts in my ear. You were selfish. You abandoned her for an illusion. A real man would have stayed, would have fought differently. Drinking became a constant companion. He never left without looking over his shoulder, always wary of spotting a familiar face in the crowd. The peace I found in my new community was real, but it was a besieged peace. I knew the war wasn't over. I was only in a temporary trench, and the most dangerous enemy was my own memory, and the love for those I left behind. It was in a conversation with an older man in our group, someone who had also experienced the transition between religions, that everything began to fall into place for me. I opened up about the weight of my past, about how everything I had learned, years of studying the Quran, Islamic law, now seemed like useless baggage, wasted time. He interrupted me, staring straight into my eyes, and said firmly, "Useless? Ahmed, you don't understand what you're saying. Your experience hasn't erased your past. It's transformed it. You speak their language. You understand their hearts, their fears, and their hopes in a way none of us could." These words fell upon me like a revelation. Suddenly, everything made sense. My experience wasn't just for my own salvation. It was a divine calling, a purpose that permeated everything I had been up until that point. Being an imam hadn't been a mistake, but a preparation. I had been called precisely because I knew that word. The weight I felt at the mosque returned, but with a new meaning. It was no longer about rigid rules and traditions, but about building bridges. It was a call to bring light where there was darkness, to speak to a multitude that was still trapped but could listen. That night, I could barely close my eyes, but it wasn't anguish that kept me awake. It was a burning fire, an urgency impossible to ignore. I had hidden too long. I had healed enough to act now. To remain quiet, comfortable in the safety of my new community, would be the greatest betrayal. A betrayal of Jesus, who found me in the midst of darkness, and of all those who still silently cried out for freedom, unaware of its existence. I knew that speaking out was dangerous, that exposing myself could awaken the ghosts of the past, bring persecution, and destroy the peace I had fought so hard to achieve. But how could I remain silent? How could I guard the key I had been given and not use it to open doors for others? The decision became clear and firm within me. I would tell my story, not to attack the faith that once defined me, but to be a beacon of hope for those still trapped. Maybe I'd lose everything, maybe even my life, but silence would cost me my soul. Here I am then, no longer Imam Ahmed, imprisoned by traditions, nor the frightened fugitive hiding in the shadows. I am simply Ahmed, a man who has been broken and restored. The fear still exists of I know the risks I run in sharing these words, but fear no longer has the final say. The peace I found in that emptiness, the purpose that has burned within me ever since, is greater. Each day is a conscious choice to follow this new path. I am no longer defined by what I lost, my home, my family, my honor. I am defined by what I found in that moment outside of time, a love that demands nothing and a truth that liberates. And the first step of this new journey, this mission, is this: opening my heart and telling you my story. I want you to know that this isn't about one religion being better than. For me, this is the story of the difference between living in a cage and finding heaven. I lived trapped in the most beautiful and respected cage anyone could imagine, and that prison nearly destroyed me. What Jesus revealed to me was not a list of new rules, but the gateway to freedom. The spiritual warfare he spoke of is real, and its most dangerous weapons are fear and division, tools used by powerful men who hide their true faces behind masks of piety. My message is simple: the truth that sets you free is not locked away in building, books, or the authority of any man. It awaits you, there in the silence of your heart, the moment you have the courage to question the fear you were taught to fear. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened to me on that prayer mat. It doesn't fit with logic. Was it a breakdown, a vision, a hallucination caused by exhaustion and stress? None of these words seem sufficient to describe that darkness, that presence, that voice. It was, by far, the most real thing that has ever happened to me. It left an eternal mark on my soul, a scar that doesn't hurt, but that constantly reminds me of a single truth. I don't have all the answers. I haven't become wise. I've become a pilgrim, a man who knows one thing clearly. I was blind, and now I see. This experience hasn't given me a map, but a compass, and it always points away from fear and toward love. That's why I'm here, sharing my story. Speaking out, exposing myself, is the fulfillment of a promise I made to myself. It's my first step out of my comfort zone, out of my trenches. I don't know what tomorrow holds. I don't know if these words will put me in danger, if the past will come back to find me, or if I'll ever see my family again. Everything I had was traded for this moment of truth. But silence is no longer an option. This is my story. This is my testimony. Now, the question I leave you with is this. What is the cage that holds you captive? And do you have the courage to seek the key? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one of them, because your journey matters in this spiritual battle. If this message touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next steps we'll take together on this journey toward the light. Many ask me how to support this mission. If you feel this calling, next to the subscribe button is a participate button. By clicking it, you become a pillar of strength, helping bring this light to even more people who need to hear this truth. The search does not end here. Click on the video that is appearing on your screen now, and check out another powerful testimony that will expand your vision. Thank you for having the courage to listen. Peace be with you.